Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Jewish Gen Talk. We're glad you're here. We will get started in about a minute. And as we always do, please post a message. I ask that you please post a message in the chat. Let us know where you are logging in from in the world. It's always nice to see people and where they're participating from. And we'll get started in about a minute. So we have Jake Block from Hamilton, New Jersey. We have Rebecca in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have Arlene Waters in Tucson, Arizona. Lauren Ransford in Seattle. Sona in Corona, California. Thousand Oaks, California. Scott Chase in Glasgow. Welcome. Bonnie Burns, welcome. Amy Mitchell, welcome. We have Lynn in Arlington, welcome. We have Duluth, Minnesota, Joanna Scher, welcome. Ann Wright from Seattle. Paul Chaffetz from our Latvia Research Division, calling in from Israel, welcome. Jack Holy from McLean, Virginia. We have Chelsea, New York. Mannheim, Germany, Philip, welcome. We have Chris from Connecticut and Barry Cast in Oregon. Suzanne Hoffman from Chicago, welcome, from the Jewish Genealogical Society there, I believe. We have Billy Stein from Give a Time in Israel. For those of you logging in, we're about to get started, and please let us know in the chat where you're from. Amy Wasatsky in Louisville, Kentucky, welcome. Sandy Rips from Seal Beach in California. We have Jody Ames, I think, from Albany, California. Vicki Sentmans from North Carolina. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Avram Grol, and I'm privileged to oversee JewishGen, which is the Jewish Genealogical Research Division of the Museum of Jewish Heritage Living Memorial to the Holocaust, based in Lower Manhattan here in New York City. Today's talk is part of our ongoing Jewish Gen Talk series of educational webinars. Emily Garber today is our guest speaker and expert. She will be talking about naturalization records. A little bit about Emily. Truth is, she really needs no introduction within the Jewish genealogy world. However, in case you're not familiar, she is a genealogy researcher, writer, and speaker. She is an anthropological archaeologist by training and has been researching her family history since 2007. She has a certificate from Boston University's Genealogical Research Program and owns Extra Yad Genealogical Services. She has an abiding interest in family history, methodology, and historical context. She blogs at extrayad.blogspot.com. That's extrayad.blogspot.com. She's written 2 books and several articles on genealogical research that have appeared in a number of Jewish genealogical journals. She serves as chair of the Phoenix Jewish Genealogy Group and is on the board of directors of both the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies and the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. So very eminently qualified to talk to us today. A couple of notes. The session is being recorded, and thank you, Emily, for allowing us to put it on the YouTube channel after the presentation. If you are on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel so you can be notified anytime we add a new video. We will send out an email following the presentation with a link to the video and also a link to register for next week's webinar as well. If you would like to ask any questions, please put them in the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. Please do not put them in the chat. It will be very difficult for us to pull those out. The questions, please try to keep general in nature. And finally, I'm going to enable the live transcription. Let me just do that now before I forget. And then we will get started. I'd like to thank Emily again for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. And we'll do that. And whoops, share and share. And can you see my one slide?
Yes, perfect. It's in presentation mode. Everything looks great.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll get started. And thank you all for being here today. I know you're taking time out from making your pies and whatever else, and I do appreciate it. Okay, what just happened here? It just went backwards. Okay, all right. Are we seeing this slide? For some reason, it's going back to, I'm having trouble. Are you guys seeing the slide, or are you seeing a,
No, we're seeing the full, there you go. Now you're back.
okay, but every time let's see, I'm gonna try this again. No, it's going away. Very strange. Okay, I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so we're in presentation mode. And when I click it, it goes away. And I don't know why it's doing
I think
that.
you're on the last slide.
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good reason. Thank you. I'm glad you pointed that out to me. All right. Okay, now we're good. Okay, so
There you go.
sorry about that. Today we're going to talk about naturalization, a little bit about immigration, but mostly focused on the naturalization aspect of things. And naturalization, of course, is the process by which immigrants become citizens. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the United States process. In the United States, it's our Constitution that granted Congress the power to establish procedures. Now, of course, as genealogists, we just love these records, especially the ones that are post-1906, because they have much more information. And most of the time, we use them for things like finding out what the immigrant's name was in the old country, information about their voyage, where they came from, where they embarked, where they got off the boat, finding their birthplace and residence. Those are all critical things if we want to eventually take ourselves overseas. And of course, many times, particularly in the later manifests that we can find through naturalization, or even on the naturalization records themselves, we can find things about family members, sometimes when people got married, or their children's birth dates and things like that. All good stuff. But what I hope to impart with you today, leave you with today, is that naturalization records are much more than just clues to locate manifests. They can really give us some really good information about the lives and the challenges that some of our immigrants had early on, or even many years after, when they finally decided to naturalize, if they didn't do so immediately. Between 1906 and the 1930s, there were many, many changes in the naturalization process. And that's probably the period when a lot of our immigrants naturalized. Now, there are some earlier than that, and we'll talk a little bit about that process. But today, we're really going to be focusing on this later period. During this period, you see lots of different types of records come up, and some new challenges to those who want to naturalize. What I'm going to talk about today is I'll present 2 case studies, and then some of the types of records available and where to find them. You'll see those during the case studies. And we'll also talk about some best practices. So before the Naturalization Act of June 29th, 1906, people could pretty much naturalize in any court. It could be a police court, it could be a local court, it could be a federal court. Lots of different places where naturalization records or naturalization process may have taken place. And because it was so diffuse, there were many different forms that were used. Some give you some good information. You might find out when approximately when people arrived in the United States, but there are a lot of them where they give you very little. This actually, the one I'm showing you, is not too horrendous, doesn't give you a whole lot of information. I have even seen ones that pretty much only have the person's name and the city, and that's about it. But the bottom line is there was no centralized record keeping. So when you're looking for records from prior to June 29th, 1906, or prior to actually September of that year when the law went into effect, sometimes it's hard to figure out where people actually naturalized. And this was because Congress at this point had delegated the process to all sorts of different courts. The United States government, or the federal government, or the Senate and the House of Representatives started rethinking this process. Now, the basic process throughout our history is that people needed to put in a declaration of intention, which is often called the first papers. This was the first step to admitting an alien to citizenship, the first step in the process. process. In some cases, actually, certain privileges were granted. Sometimes early on, people actually could file a homestead claim. You see that more out west. With if they had declared their intention to become a citizen. They didn't have to be a citizen, they just made the declaration. In some places, they could own real estate. Amazingly, considering what we go through now in terms of who is allowed to vote, in some states, people were actually allowed to vote if they had just declared their intention to become a citizen. Later on, we get the petition, and after 1906, that provided really much more comprehensive information about the alien, the family, the journey, like I said earlier. And then finally, they would get a certificate of naturalization, which basically was the court's written testimony that the rights of citizenship had been conferred. Now, when they filed a declaration with the court, one copy stayed with the court, and one copy was actually given to the alien. So if you're wondering whether or not somebody had become a citizen and you haven't been able to figure that out or find anything further, but you found within your family files an actual declaration of intention, it might be that they never completed the process, because usually what had to happen is they would initially get that declaration of intention, and when they came back to finalize the process, they had to turn that paper into the court. So if it's still sitting with the alien's family, they may not have completed the process. And then we talked about the petition and the certificate of naturalization. And sometimes the certificate of naturalization is also identified in the court minutes. And that's something else you can look for. Now, the act itself in 1906 was effective, as I said earlier, at the end of September 1906. And it federalized the naturalization process, and it created the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization. What pretty much happened was, we know that in the 1891, they federalized the naturalization, the immigration process rather, at Ellis Island. And they did that because there had been a lot of fraud and a lot of people had been taken advantage of as they were trying to immigrate. And the federal government took back the process that they had delegated previously to the states. They found over the years, not that many years, about 15, 16 years, that this was very successful, and they decided to do the same with the naturalization process. As I mentioned earlier, they tried to take the information and make it formally on a particular form that everybody had to use throughout the United States. So they identified the information that they wanted to be included on the naturalization forms, and they created a new document called the Certificate of Arrival for those who arrived after September 1906. So if your people arrived before then, you probably will not see a certificate of arrival, even if they naturalized after that point. Just so you know, this law was quite a bit changed over the period of years, and we won't really go beyond about 1940, 1942 in this talk, but the law between 1906 and 1940 was amended about 20 times. So there were changes during this period when there was a lot of naturalization going on. Now, the first form you see, of course, is the Declaration of Intention, and many of us have seen this. This is one from a little bit later, but this one's from 1925. Basically, an immigrant needed to file this form with a court in their district of residence, and it was filed in triplicate. The court received one copy. The one copy was sent to the Washington office of the Bureau of Immigration, and one copy, again, was kept by the alien, which needed to be turned in later. Now, this is a form that probably not many of you have seen. It's not generally available. I actually found these online in McHenry County, Illinois, in their county office. And basically, it's a form that, if you look at it, you'll see that a lot of the information on this form is typically what you see on a petition. This is the form that the immigrant filled out, or sat down and filled out with a clerk, and then this information was then transferred onto the petition. This was filed with the local immigration office, and it's form 2214. And you'll see here, and I'll make that bigger, this form is not a petition, but is used to obtain essential information which must be furnished by the applicant before a petition may be filed. So it says right there exactly what's going to happen with this information. And it's so after they do their declaration of intention, they file this information on Form 2214, it is then used for further information. Now, where can you find these files, aside from McHenry County, Illinois, which is very unusual? Supposedly, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, which is the current version of the U.S. Bureau of Immigration, has something called a P file. And we think, they're probably somewhere in another building in the archive, and they have not been real forthcoming in letting us have these things. They're not something you can get through their genealogy program, which I'll talk about later. I actually have a request for one right now. I had to put in a Freedom of Information Act request to get this, and we'll see if we'll get it. It's going to take a while, as everything does, unfortunately, with USCIS these days. But this form, as I said, was filed with the local immigration office, and then some of them may have wound up at some point in the Washington office of the Bureau of Immigration, but they weren't put into the rest of the immigration files, like the C files that we see now today. After the form was filed, they would go to the place where the immigrant arrived, the port of arrival, and they would ask them to please verify that this person came into the country legally. And that verification was generated on a form called the Certificate of Arrival, this new form that was generated by the 1906 Act. And this is an example of one of them. This then was attached to the petition, which they then created after they received this document. A petition could be filed 2 to 7 years after the declaration was made. A person had to have lived in the country for 5 years and 1 year in the state of residence. So you couldn't just move and 6 months later, start your citizenship process. You needed to be able to, you could actually file your declaration in one state and then file your petition in another, but you had to have lived in that second state at least a year. And you do see that occasionally where they had to go back to a court in another case to get a copy of the declaration to file with the court of record. One copy of the petition stayed with the court, and one copy was sent to the Washington office of the Bureau of Immigration. Finally, about 90 days, at least 90 days after the petition, there was a hearing in the court, and people could renounce their former potentate, if you will, the former country, take an oath after a hearing and be granted citizenship if all went well. And that is the last page of what you usually see online, the Oath of Allegiance. The only document that the citizen went away with was their certificate of citizenship, and many of you will see this in your family's files. One copy was given to the citizen and one copy was sent to the Washington office. And you'll note, if you've ever tried to order records from the actual court of record, they don't have a copy of this usually. Usually this, you can get this through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, or you might have one at home. The court kept a stub of this in books or in the late 1920s as index cards. And the index cards may also be with the Washington office. When we see these kind of things, a lot of times both Family Search, I believe, and Ancestry, and perhaps other big companies as well, have digitized these little index cards. What they actually were the stubs. And they were cut down, and you can see how they were cut down here on the sides of this card. The number that says petition number, that's actually the naturalization file number. The petition was used as the file number. And if you're curious to know about the USCIS file number, which you may have heard of, that's the number that's on the top. But anyway, this is just to give you an idea. This actually was a stub originally. Now, So when we start this, we want to do our best practices for understanding these records. And so my recommendation, and we'll talk about, you'll see this as we move through a couple of case studies, is the first thing you want to do is create a timeline for your subject. Where were they? What did they, how were they approaching the process? How long were they in a particular location? Things like that. And then it's also a nice idea to have an idea of the timeline for the various immigration and naturalization laws, because they could affect the kinds of records that you'll find and where. I suggest you read up on the relevant USCIS and National Archives records, and I've given you in your handout, which I believe should be a link to that should be in the chat. You can read up on some of these things, and I suggest you do that. Also, and we'll talk about this in a moment, in a little while, learn what the notations mean on various records, especially passenger manifests, because they interface, as you'll see in a couple of these examples. So let me start with the first case study, and that's a fellow by the name of Morris Lederman. He was born about 1891 in Anapol, which was in Ostrog district, Volhynia Gubernia, the province. Today, it would be called Hanopil in Ukraine. And you could see more or less where it is. Here's Kyiv, and about 150 miles or so to the west is where his town was. So he arrived in the United States on the 29th of, I'm sorry, he immigrated rather, on the 29th of August 1910. Actually, that's when he did arrive. He left Rotterdam on the 20th of August. He was 19 years old, from Anopil. His father was Lieb Lederman. Actually, we know him as Levi Yitzhak Lederman, and he also lived in that community. Now, I know a little bit about Morris's early time in the United States, even before he was recorded in various records, because I found out in talking to the family that there were about 30 cards and postcards and letters written by Morris's father to him in the first few years that he was in the United States. So between about August 1910, when he arrived, and for a year, he lived in New York City and Manhattan. About August 1911, he moved to Lynn, Mass, and stayed there for a few years. And finally, in 1914, he wound up sometime in 1914 in Detroit. I'm not incredibly sure when, exactly sure when, but about that time. The next record that I find for him is his registration card for the World War I draft. And he was on the first draft registration. There were several. We'll talk about that. And he registered on June 5th, 1917. And you can see here that he identified himself as an alien. So he still had not done anything after those 7 years that he'd been in the United States, almost 7 years, to get his citizenship. Now, let's talk a little bit about World War I, and so we can understand what these records were. The US declared war against Germany, or entered the war essentially, on April 6th, 1917. So they started they didn't have a draft at that point, but in 1918, on the 18th of May, 1917, they initiated their draft. And the first time people needed to actually start registering, or men started to register, was in June of that year. People who had already, now the United States kind of knew that they were heading in this direction, so there were already some troops ready to go. They sent their first group of troops starting in June 1917 to Europe. And by October 1917, they really had a full complement of troops at the front. By just a year later, a little bit over a year later, the war was over and Germany signed armistice. So it wasn't that long, but it was a little over a year and a half, I guess, that we were actually in the war. Now, so we declared war in April 1917. The Selective Service Act of May 18 1917, that was when they said all these men needed to register for the draft. And this included aliens. So you didn't have to be a citizen to register the draft. If you were in the United States and you were a male, you needed to register as long as you're within a certain age. There were actually 3 registrations, as I showed you. Morris registered for the first. One was in June 1917. A year later, those who had turned 21 by that time had to register. And finally, in September 12th, 1918, they broadened it out and included any male between 18 and 45. Ultimately, all men born from about 1873 and between 1873 and 1900 needed to register. So if you haven't found one for your great-great-grandfather, you might look if he was born 1873 or beyond. I actually was surprised to find one for my great-great-grandfather who was born in 1874, but it should be there. Ultimately, 24 million people, men registered, and 2.8 million were inducted into the military. So we had Morris registering for the draft in 1917, and then I don't see anything about him at all until the 1920 census, which occurred in January. And that showed in this red circle there that he had arrived in 1910, which was accurate, and it shows that he was naturalized in 1919. And so I'm going, well, where did that happen? And I tried looking in the Detroit area and did not find anything. So the question was, where did he naturalize? And when did this happen? Well, I actually found some records that indicated that he was indeed one of the people who wound up in the service. Let's see, this was the 22nd of July, 1918. I have this departure manifest sending him over to Europe. And he entered the service actually on the 26th of April, 1918. And so just a few months later, he was on his way. You'll see him, you see him at the bottom there. So then we see he was actually put into the Machine Gun Company 339th Infantry, also known as the Michigan Polar Bears. And this was a group of people from mostly Michigan and some from Wisconsin. And you'll see in a moment why they were called the Polar Bears. It's actually a very famous, or well-known anyway, group of a group from World War I. And there he is down there. So what is it and why were they called the Polar Bears? Well, this was actually pretty horrendous. We know that the war was over in November 1918. These guys got over to Europe and were sent initially to the front in France, but things were starting to wind down a little bit. And President Wilson at the time, as well as allies from England and France and other places, decided that what they really needed to do, because they were very worried, was to send some troops up to Archangel in Russia to fight against the Red Army, or at least support, not so much fight, but support the White Army in their fight against the Red Army. And they were trying to keep supply lines open. If you look at this map, you'll see here's Moscow down here, and here's where they were sent. It was at the Arctic Circle, essentially. Very cold, very terrible. And even though the war was over in November 1918, these guys from the 339th were still there in June 1919. And you can see some of these photographs. It was cold and snowy and terrible. And as unfortunately happens a lot of times when people are sent in support functions, they did wind up taking casualties. They did wind up in fights with the Red Army. So this is actually, interestingly, the only time that the United States has been in a military campaign on Russian soil. And as a result of this, there were a lot of people not understanding why they were there, why all the other doughboys had been sent home, but they were still there. And when everybody, about 6 months later, or 7, 8 months later, they're still in Europe when everybody else is home. So there were mutinies. There were a lot of people who just were very unhappy in this situation. And as it turns out, through looking at some records of this company's daily reports that are in the National Archives in Maryland, I did find a record of Private Lederman who was taken from the 339th and attached to their medical detachment on February 21st, 1919. Now, we don't know what his medical issue was, if it was physical or mental or whatever. It could have been anything. Ultimately, I found another record, and this one from the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan for this group. There actually is, my understanding is actually like a little museum exhibit all about them at the Bentley Library, that he actually was on the 1st of June, 1919, determined with a whole bunch of other people you can see on this record, unfit for duty. And what they said, and I apologize for it's so fuzzy, but this is, a carbon copy. And what they said basically, that they had determined that these people were disabled, unfit for further duty, active service, and they were sent to London. So they got out of Archangel, maybe this was a way of doing it, and went to London to a hospital there. So he was in this convalescent detachment, and we finally see him coming back to the United States. This is a passenger manifest from the military transport, sending him back to Bergen County, New Jersey, Camp Merritt, on the 7th of July, 1919. Now, interestingly, I was still following the polar bears, and in the Detroit Free Press, they had an article saying, oh, by the way, on the 8th of July, the polar bears, the 339th, came back to the United States, and they're in Camp Custer in Battle Creek, Michigan, and they will be demobilized. So I still wasn't sure, okay, so we know that he was on the 7th, he was at Camp Merritt. We don't know if he stayed there at this point. One thing I wanted to mention, this article was really about was that they were going to do an event where all the aliens who were in the 339th were going to be naturalized. So what was going on here? The act of May 9th, 1918. At this time, the government decided that any alien who had served honorably would be eligible regardless of their time in the United States. They would be eligible for naturalization by virtue of serving honorably in the military. So they did these things like the very last day before people were going to be mustered out of their unit. They did not have to file a declaration of intent. So therefore, we know the next step after that was a certificate of arrival. There wouldn't have been one of those. And they didn't have to have proof of 5 years residency. So a lot of people took this opportunity as a result of having served honorably. Now we know from Morris's official military personnel file, which I got from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, that he mustered out on the 31st of July, 1919 from Camp Sherman in Ohio. So he came back to Camp Merritt. His old unit was at Camp Custer, and then he mustered out in Chillicothe, Ohio. So I was confused. I was trying to figure out, well, where could his naturalization file actually be? As I said, I checked in Wayne County, Detroit, Michigan. It wasn't there. Detroit naturalizations, a lot of times if they were done with a federal court, they would wind up in Nara, Chicago. I checked with them. They didn't have it. Bergen County didn't have it. Battle Creek, Michigan, for where Camp Custer was, didn't have it. I even contacted Ross County, Camp Sherman, thinking, well, that was his last location. They didn't have it. So I finally bit the bullet and decided, well, I'm going to have to pay the big bucks and wait a while. And I contacted through the genealogy program at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service, asked for an index search. They did find his C file, which was actually very short. It basically had the petition and his certificate of naturalization. And this is what his petition looked like, very sparse in terms of information. I said he was demobilized, essentially. He was mustered out on the 31st of July, the day before. He naturalized in the Court of Common Pleas of Ross County, Ohio, but for some reason it wasn't filed there. It was sent to Washington. And you could see where it's circled here very kindly. They say, hey, this was filed under the provision of the Act of May 9th, 1918, which was the act that allowed honorably discharged veterans to go ahead and get their citizenship in a shortened process. But you'll see here, I have no information whatsoever on when he arrived, no information about a ship, no information about family, anything like that. And all I got basically were 2 pages, a certificate and a petition, but I wasn't able to find that anyplace else, so I was happy. And here is a copy of his certificate of naturalization. This actually, interestingly enough, is a duplicate. So sometime he must have lost it or misplaced it, and he asked for another copy on July 30th, 1943. But it actually occurred, his naturalization occurred in 1919. And here you can see the court is identified, state of Ohio, county of Ross, things like that. So we do have that information now. So what we see here is that there are some additional records that fill out the story. I did finally get in touch with family members and got some information from them who confirmed that he had been in a hospital in London. That's actually where he met his wife. But I also got some records from the National Archives, Record Group 120, which is records of the American Expeditionary Forces. They had the 339th Infantry daily reports and after action reports. They had their payroll reports. I was able to get some information, also morning reports from Record Group 391. I actually didn't do this myself. I hired a company to do this for me because I wasn't about to go to Maryland, and it was cheaper to do it that way than go there myself. Plus, these people know how to find these things, and I did not have that experience. But you also need to look for other kinds of records, particularly for units. There are company histories that you can find. A lot of time, many of them have been digitized on Google, on HathiTrust, on Family Search in their digitized records in their books, lots of different places. And there are some like this one on the left, the Michigan polar bears, which actually is a story about them that has been published in a book form. So I do recommend, particularly if you're looking into these military records, that you make sure to see if you can find a company history. It can be really useful. I'm going to take a sip of water and then we'll start on Davette. So Davette was born about the same time, very close in time, to Morris Lederman. He's on the opposite side of my family. Morris is actually related to my father. Dave is related to my mother. And while Morris was from Russia, Dave was from the Austrian Empire, from a little town called Torsky. It's in the Zaleszczyki area of Galicia, or it was. And actually, the town is still there. His parents were Hirschlieb Et and Perel Wenkert, or Wenkert. This is where the little red dot is. That shows you the general area of Zaleszczyki. And some of the towns that I'll be talking about include at the top of the map on the right, Tluste, Usteczko, Torsky, which I've already mentioned, and of course, Zaleszczyki. So here's Dave's passenger manifest. He left Hamburg in October 1907. He was David Et. He was 17 years old, from Austria. There he says he was living in the town of Usteczko, and his father was Lieb Wenkert, which is interesting, also from Usteczko, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Second page of the passenger manifest, because of course, after this time, there were 2 pages to the passenger manifest. He arrived on November in New York on November 10th, 1907. He said he was going to a friend, Isaac Grabstern, who I actually believe might have been a relative, but I'm not quite sure of that yet. And he said he was born in Tluste. So we're getting some interesting differences, but basically from that Zaleszczyki, Tluste, Torski, Usteczko area. Now, you see this interesting thing here. We've got this big cross out. And that I wondered about. Now, I'm very lucky in that he came through Hamburg. And because he did, we do know that there were some departure manifests from Hamburg that have been digitized and are online. So I thought, well, I wonder what the Hamburg Manifest says, because it looks like something was crossed out and I couldn't tell what. So I looked at his name here and all the different names above it to see if I could find on the passenger manifest who else he was near. And when I did that, comparing again, this is the American manifest with this one, and don't worry about the line through the Hamburg manifest. But basically what you see is where it says David et on the passenger manifest in the United States, the departure manifest from Hamburg says David Wenkert or Wenkert. Interesting. Now, I mentioned earlier that his mother's last name was his mother's maiden name was Wenkert. So let's just jump into some of his records for naturalization, and we'll get back to that issue in a little while. So here is his initial declaration of intention. This was filed in 1912, and I couldn't find any petitions, so it didn't appear that he had ever actually finished the process. He had 2 to 7 years to do so, to file his petition after his declaration of intention, but there was no indication that he had done so. The process at that time was you file your declaration, you then get your certificate of arrival, you file a petition, and then if you had people vouching for you, there might be an affidavit, you would do your oath, and then you would get your certificate of naturalization if they finished the process. But it didn't seem that he had done so here. He had filed his declaration as the Supreme Court of Kings County, which he was still allowed to do at that time. So here's his World War I draft card. He filed the same day that Morris Lederman did. And here, though, he shows that and this is accurate, that he had declared this was still within the 7-year period of when he had declared his intent to naturalize. He had not done so yet. This was 1917. He had declared in 1912. So he was still within that 5-year, 7-year interval, but and he was accurate here. Now, interestingly, New York has some wonderful records. Don't always have these great things, but they did in this case. A record of basically cards that summarize the World War I service of different people who had served in the United States military. And we see that Dave was actually inducted into the military on the 8th of December, 1917. He was discharged a little over 6 months later, about 7 months later, and he was discharged. He was identified as an alien enemy, or an enemy alien, more likely. So this was kind of interesting, and we wanted to know, well, what was going on here? Well, basically, on the 6th of April, 1917, when the United States joined the war effort, declared war on Germany, every German national who was in the United States became an enemy alien. And there were restrictions on them where they could go on their movements, their activities. They had to register with the government. Now, the Germans didn't conquer Austria-Hungary until December of that year. So prior to that, Austrians, like Dave, were not considered enemy aliens. But as soon as Germany took over Austria-Hungary, every every Austrian in the United States became an enemy alien as well. By that point, many of these Austrian non-citizens, non-citizens were well integrated into the United States economy, so they weren't necessarily treated as harshly as the Germans had been, but nevertheless, they needed to register with the government. It took a little while for the military to catch up, but ultimately they wound up deciding that they were going to discharge all these aliens from Austria and Germany out of the military. And so there was, I found this article from the Spokesman Review, but they had similar articles all over the United States from the spring of 1918 saying that these soldiers were going to be mustered out of the army, and then they had to register within 10 days of their discharge in the state and the district into which they were going to reside. So Dave pretty much got kicked out of the military. So in 1927, he applied again. He filled out his petition, did the forms to fill out for his petition for naturalization, and he wound up, on trying to do so under the Act of May 26, 1926. What this was an extension of the law that allowed people who were honorably discharged to apply for an expedited naturalization. And so you'll see down here, he says, well, yeah, I enlisted on December 8th, 1927. I was honorably discharged in July 1918. And he gave all his information and said, because of all this, I should be able to naturalize without going through all the declaration and the certificate of arrival and all this stuff. And they said, no, we're rejecting you. And the reason why they rejected him is they said he was not eligible under that act of the May 26, 1926. So what happened here? What about this act? Well, World War I veterans, the act provided a number of different things. It provided one that they would extend, as I said, the opportunity for these World War I veterans who had not taken advantage of the expedited process to continue to do so into the 1920s. But there were some exceptions, and Dave fell under one of these exceptions. The exception that he fell under was that he was discharged on account of his alienage. He was an enemy alien, and he was separated from the military on that basis. Other people who were conscientious objectors or who were separated from the military under less than honorable conditions also could not use this law to get expedited naturalization. So he was rejected. The next thing I saw was one of these little index cards, these stubs. And this did show that Dave actually finally got to naturalize on July 18th, 1939, and it shows a petition number. So I knew that I could find something, and I did. Now, what's interesting here, now remember the original form from process from 1906 on was you file a declaration, you fill out form 2214, you get your certificate of arrival, and then that leads to your petition. You wait 90 days and then at least 90 days, and then you could get affidavits from people to support your application. You take an oath and you get your certificate of naturalization if all goes well. But what happened here is I saw something that was kind of out of order. Here we see that he filled out his certificate of arrival on June 17th, 1936, and his declaration after that. So what is going on? And we see the other two records that we get dates on, his petition on March 1st, 1939, and his naturalization on July 18th, 1939. Those fit within the situation, but the earlier two are out of order. So what happened? Well, what happened was the Act of June 8th, 1926. Between 1926 and 1929, as a result of this act, examiners were placed in all the different courts that had jurisdiction over providing citizenship, of processing for naturalization. The reason why this happened is because there was still some challenges going on with people who put in their declaration and then, for whatever reason, couldn't prove their that they had entered the country legally. So people were being terribly disappointed. And there were also situations where you found that there was a lot of fraud going on. People were taking other names or using other, they were just doing whatever they could at that point to go on with the process. What the examiners would do is they would interview the petitioner. The court didn't really have the manpower, essentially, to do this previously, but with these examiners, then they could delve a little bit more into these particular applicants. So they interviewed the petitioner, they interviewed character witnesses under oath before anybody even submitted a declaration of intent. So they did away with 2214 form. They created a new form called 2213. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy of that one. But that was given in then before the declaration. As a result of that, they then went back to the ports of arrival, got documentation that the person had arrived legally. Then they could file their declaration and petition, and the rest of the process was the same. So basically, the certificate of arrival was issued to the alien and filed now, not with the petition like before, but filed with the declaration itself. So I want to jump here to some things that were on Dave's manifest that are interesting. We see several little notations on his manifest. Over in the name area, we see a VL and a number 22320. We see that here, and we also see that here, the same number 22320. And then there's another one here, which basically is the date of his certificate of arrival. We had seen that was the 17th of June. So they actually checked it on the 16th of June, 1936. Now, a lot of times, these are just some of the kinds of notations you'll see on a manifest. This is a Jewish Gen talk. So let me tell you something terrific that JewishGen has online among their info files. If you are not familiar with this and you've been working with manifests, I highly suggest you get familiar with it. The JewishGen manifest marking info file is one of my favorite things. It's just chock full of information. If you see some markings, note where they are on the manifest, which column, and then go through this. And you might just walk through it. Even if you're not doing that, just familiarize yourself, because it is so data rich and such a wonderful opportunity to learn more about things that happened after arrival, what things that were written on the manifest later due to various different checks that an immigrant might have gone through or a citizen might have gone through it later in their lives in the United States. What I want to point out to you on that VL that we saw over the name is represents what's called the Registry Act of 1929. So we saw that Dave had tried to go through the process twice before, and the third time he was still held up. And he was now affected by a law in 1929. The Registry Act, I mentioned earlier, they had changed some things in 1926 because people were having trouble. Well, they still didn't have any way of solving the problem for people for whom they could find no arrival record. People needed, since the 1906 Act, to be able to prove that they had entered the country legally. And the way that was done was to find their passenger manifest. Well, for some people, and we all know this is true, it's really hard to find their passenger manifest. And some people, they never did. And so these people would have been left in limbo, essentially. The government decided they didn't want to leave these people in limbo, particularly if they had lived a good life and were, upstanding citizens, or could have been upstanding citizens. So if someone had arrived couldn't find the arrival record, We know in the naturalization process that no certificate of arrival could be issued and they could not naturalize. And the process, we know, was changed a little bit in 1926, that you had to first get your certificate of arrival before you could even declare that you were interested in becoming a citizen. What the Registry Act of 1929 did was it created an opportunity to backdate an arrival record. In other words, if they couldn't find one, they could collect enough information to show that this person had been in the United States for the requisite number of years, had lived an outstanding life, and that could be accepted even though they couldn't find the arrival record. So those who are eligible. You couldn't be an alien who was not eligible for citizenship. And at that time, pretty much that meant Chinese people were not eligible for citizenship. There might have been some other categories as well. No record of admission was located, so they would apply this registry procedure. You had to have entered the United States before June 1921, and they later extended it to 1924. You had to have resided in the United States since you had entered and you had been continuously a resident. You had to be of good moral character, they evaluated that, and not subject to deportation for any other reason. Now, I have to say, Dave's a little bit of an unusual case, so let me show you what a normal case would look like on some of these records. And this is a case for Shlomo Rossoff, who became Samuel Rossoff. And you can see here, he also has this little notation over his name on the passenger manifest. But his certificate of arrival has a couple of things. One is this R. And the R, if you see that R number, that indicates that he had to go through a registration procedure under the Registry Act of 1929. And here, of course, they nicely even say certificate of registry issued. So you've got two indications on his certificate of arrival. Turns out I was able to find his number, but they went through the process. Find his manifest, but they went through the process anyway, and apparently did find it at some point. And he arrived in 1913. So what do you find in these files? And these files are ones that you have to, they're not online, they're not digitized. This is something that you have to request. I would suggest requesting an index review with USCIS. And then if they find that, you might identify a registry number and they might find it. What the registry file does, and I got for Dave, I got more than 20 pages, close to 30 pages of documents. It's documentary evidence of his activities in the United States. It includes all sorts of different things. His employment, where he lived all this time, if he attended school, if it were organizations he belonged to, photos and interviews with him and with friends and relatives, so it can really help you identify people. And this is just an idea of some of the content. This is a page, and it shows some of the basic information, including things like here, all the different places that he lived and when. I mean, this is something that you'd have to build yourself, and you might not capture all that, but he had to write all that down, as well as all the different companies that he worked for here. So it's very cool. And then there were interviews. And so he had actually two interviews. In his first interview, they asked him several questions. What was your father's name? And he says, well, Hirschlieb et. What was your mother's maiden name? Well, her name was Peril Wenkert, or Peril Wenkert. They asked him all sorts of questions about his wife and his children. And although the records are not, the birth certificates are not in the file, they didn't keep them, they did look at those. So you can assume then that any dates and stuff that they had on these records were going to be based upon the birth records of his children who were born in the United States. And finally, they said, well, to whom were you destined in this country? And he said, oh, I was going to my sister, Clara Rappaport, which actually was not true. He misremembered. And he says, what was her husband's name, Alter or Adolf? This is the part that's not true is that that's not who he identified on his passenger manifest, but it is true that one of his sister's last name was Rappaport, and she was married to Adolf or Alter. So if you didn't know that information, you've now got another person and her address at that time when the interview was done in 1936. So wonderful information. Clearly, after this first interview, they must have, excuse me, found his passenger manifest, and they went back and they said, well, they asked him this question: are you sure that your name was shown on the passport as David Et? And his answer was, well, you know, my name was shown either as David Et or maybe David Wenkert, false Et. So they must have seen, based upon his mother's maiden name, that he had come under Wenkert. And if you know anything about Austrian or Galician Jewish marriages, this makes some sense because, and he says, they asked him, they said, well, why do you believe your passport may have been made out to as David Wenkert rather than as David and Wenkert false Et? And he goes, because I was born, when I was born, where I was born was belonged to Austria. And if a Jewish man and a woman were not married by the Austrian government, the government did not recognize the marriage, and my parents were only married by a rabbi. In other words, they had a religious marriage. They didn't document it with the state civilly, and therefore he was known as by his mother's maiden name. His father wasn't recognized. So this is something that we know happened a lot in the Austrian Empire, and we have it documented here, and that's why you see this difference in name. When he got to the United States, his paperwork said David Wenkert, but when he got to the United States, he took his father's last name, which was Et. So they did find his arrival record under David Wenkert, and they said, these were the findings. Our recommendation is that we do have the record, and we suggest that you cross that out and fix his arrival record and amend the manifest, essentially. And I have to laugh, you know, we was talking about names weren't changed at Ellis Island. Well, his name wasn't changed at Ellis Island, but it was changed in the records of Ellis Island by the authority of the government. They had to have very specific authority to change the name on the manifest many years later. Okay, and that's what happened here. So we see, I mentioned earlier that if he went through the registry process, there would be an R there, but they actually stopped the process once they found his passenger manifest. So we don't see the R there. The only reason we know that there was a registry process that he started, at least, and they went through, was because of what we found on the passenger manifest. It's not noted on in his naturalization file at all. And we do see here, where it's in red, that that was authority given to the people at Ellis Island to make this change, where they crossed out where it's, you can see here, it looks like a W. Yeah, they crossed out Wenkert and wrote in Et. And that, the only reason they did that was because they had authority from the Bureau of Immigration to do that. So for David, the third time was a charm. He likely applied with using Form 2213, and his passenger manifest listing was then not located, even though, because he turned in his name as David Et. So then he said, well, you know, I really do want to finish this process. This has been going on a long time. So he applied for registry to try to cure this situation. They determined that there actually was a legal record of admission. So therefore, registry itself was not really necessary, and they decided they would change the name on the manifest, which they did on the 17th of June, 1936. And they changed it to David Et rather than David Wenkert. He was then able, after that, to put in his declaration of intention. He was able later, 3 years later, almost, well, two and a half, well, close to 3 years later, submit a petition for naturalization, and finally, he was naturalized on the 18th of July, 1939. So those are our two case studies. I just want to give you some of the challenges of working with these records. You'll find that while naturalization records themselves, many of them are online, not all of them are online, but the background records, many of the background records that I've used are not online, and they're not indexed, or they're not very accessible, like those P files that we'd like to get a handle on, to get those 2214 and 2213 records. Some of these records were only available through the National Archives, who is actually, I've been very pleased with my work with the National Archives. They respond very quickly, generally. The USCIS, not so much. They're taking a really, really long time and they charge a lot of money. In some cases, like when I went to the military records, I had to hire a researcher. And that might be what you have to do, unless you want to go there, which could cost even more money. Just to quickly, just a few more slides to show, I got about 3 more slides just to show you some of the things that you need to think about. On the USCIS website, I suggest if you need some of these records, that you do go through the index process. Right now, it's $65 to request an index search, and another $65 if and when they find the records to get them. But there's a number of different kinds of records that you can get. If you found a passenger manifest, particularly like the ones from New York, where there's an SI in the column, in the left-hand column, and they went through special inquiry, if they went through an appeal of that special inquiry, and you'll see it, if it was determined that they were going to be deported and they decided to appeal it, there might be an appeal record with USCIS. There won't be a regular Board of Special Inquiry record, particularly from New York, but there might be a record of their appeal if they did that. And that you could get through an index search. Their naturalization records and all these background information, particularly from September 1906 on, should be with USCIS. If they went through registry between March 29 and 1944, that should be with USCIS. If they had naturalization, if they did not register, if they did not naturalize before 1940, there may be some alien registrations. Many of them are still with USCIS. Some of them have been sent to NARA, and Ancestry does have an online index, as does NARA. So you could see whether or not your records might be with NARA or might still be with USCIS. So those are the kinds of records you can get, as well as visa files. Between 1924 and 1944, we know the visas became important in 1924. Basically, they were processed. People were processed in Europe, and then so all the paperwork resided with their visa file, and then they were able to come into the United States. So a lot of that information should be with USCIS for some of your people who arrived after 1924. Now, the National Archives, excuse me, you can get naturalization files. Many are online, but if not, you can order some of these from the from the NARA offices. In particular, in these cases, if somebody naturalized before 1906 in a local court, you won't find it at NARA. You'll find it in your local court. But after that, they should be, or if they naturalized in a federal court, it should be with NARA. You will also find alien case files from 1940 on. Again, I had mentioned that most of these are still with USCIS, but they're gradually, supposedly, moving them over to NARA in Kansas City and San Francisco, depending upon what part of the country they were originally filed. Military records you can get through the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. That's a NARA office. And special inquiry records from Philadelphia only. And this is important to know. Most of these special inquiry records are not kept, but for some reason, the ones that went through Philadelphia were, and NARA Philadelphia has those. If you see with a record in Philadelphia that they went through special inquiry, I suggest you contact Philadelphia and see if you can get a copy of that record. And so let me give you some, in closing, let me give you some guidance on working with these records. First, as I mentioned earlier, it's really a good idea to always create a timeline for your person. It gives you an idea of where they were and what they were doing at various times. And again, know the timeline of the immigration and naturalization laws, because it can help you interpret what happened and the process that they had to go through. Learn what those notations are and what they mean when you see them on a manifest. And those JewishGen manifest marking info file is just gold. Read up on relevant USCIS and NARA records, what they have and what they can provide to you. This might not be an easy process. There are people who specialize in this. You might need to hire someone if it just becomes way too much. But there's a lot of good information and things you can learn about what people went through. But I can tell you, when you do finish the process and figure it all out, it's incredibly satisfying. And so my suggestion is go for it. Look at all the tiny little notes. Don't overlook anything and try to figure out what it really means. And thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll get back to it. Hi, Rami.
Emily, thank you. That was fascinating and quite informative. We really appreciate your time. We went over a little bit, so I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but maybe what we'll do is maybe you could just look through and see if there's anything specific that would be particularly relevant for everybody.
Okay,
we are
let's see.
about
It's
10 minutes
hard to
over
read them
time.
quickly, but let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Well, Nancy is asking, what can I do about the elusive manifest? All I have is the 1910 census, which indicates he arrived in 1906. He lived in Cleveland, the only name I have. And he was not naturalized. Well, I'm really talking naturalization today, so I can't necessarily, spend a lot of time on manifests, except to say there have been some really good presentations on different ways of finding manifests. Let's see, I believe, my mind has gone here on who has done that. There are some ways of looking for manifests. One of the things I suggest you can do is not look at, if the index for a particular manifest is not, you're not able to find your person, look on another website, because many different websites have different people doing the indexing, and that can help. There are also other places to look. If you can't find a manifest, then it's just going to be a challenge. What I do suggest is you look at children of that person. That can help sometimes find information about when they might have come over, particularly if the children were also immigrants. It can give you some information. Let's see. Let's see. On her naturalization papers, my relative gave her arrival on a date and ship that does not exist in the records. Yes, she gave this in the 1930s about an arrival in 1902. Any recourse for this misinformation. You just got to keep on looking and look widely and be willing, yeah, that happens a lot. I have actually even found some where they gave a date and they gave a ship, and it was the name the person gave. It was accurate, but when I look at it, it's not the right person. The age is wrong. In other words, they took somebody else's identity. It's just a challenge, and you're just going to have to keep on looking, and you might have to, look widely and be more than willing to accept a variety of different possibilities. There's not any magic answer to that, unfortunately. Let's see.
Maybe we'll do one more question.
Okay, let's see. Can you talk a little bit about derivative citizenship from a husband who was born in this country or from parents who naturalized before a child reached majority? Let me talk about the second aspect of it. If a child was under 21 when their parent naturalized, then they would become a citizen as well. If a child was born in the United States to an immigrant, they would become a citizen just by their birth. If a child was granted derivative citizenship, you should be it's possible that a early voting record, if you can find that, was used to document them. You might find something at USCIS if they tried to prove their derivative citizenship, but it could be a challenge. I've been trying that with my grandfather, who definitely had derivative citizenship, and I cannot find his father's records, citizenship records so far, my great-grandfather. But USCIS might have it if they ever applied for derivative citizenship documentation. So I apologize. If you want to send me some of these questions, I will be more than happy to try to answer them via email.
Okay, thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, very much. This was really a wonderful program and so informative, and you'll see some of the chat messages. People really have appreciated it. I've learned a lot myself. Everyone who joined us, thank you from around the world. We had people signing in. I hope that wherever you are in the world, this was helpful to you. We are going to send a follow-up email with a link to the recording so you can watch it again and take notes. Thank you, Emily, for making your email address accessible. So if anybody has any questions, we'll put it on there as well. There will also be a link to a brief survey. If you could please, if everyone could please fill it out, let us know your thoughts on today's program, if you have ideas for the future. There will also be a link to sign up for next week's webinar that will be on practicing safe computing with Hal Bookbinder, a very timely and important session as well. And for those of you in the United States, I wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. And for those of you around the world, I wish you a wonderful week ahead. And thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.